The winter air clung to everything like frostbitten glass. Police lights strobed against rows of old brick houses, painting the street in flashes of red and blue. Neighbors stood on their porches in silence, bundled in coats, watching history unfold on their doorsteps. Two officers led an elderly man out of his home, handcuffed, head bowed, gray hair matted against his wrinkled forehead. 74 years old, a reporter whispered into her phone. 53 years after the crime. No one saw this coming. Across the street, a woman clutched her scarf tighter, shaking her head. "I've known him my whole life," she murmured. He used to give candy to the kids every Halloween." The suspect shuffled slowly toward the waiting cruiser, the weight of decades pressing into each step. For the people who had grown up here, this wasn't just an arrest, it was the cracking open of an old wound they thought had healed. Minutes later, the victim's surviving relatives gathered in front of the courthouse, faces pale under the fluorescent glow of TV cameras. Her younger sister, now in her 70s herself, clutched a faded photograph of a 19-year-old girl with soft brown curls and a wide, unguarded smile. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "We never stopped waiting. Every birthday, every holiday, there was always an empty chair. I prayed I'd live long enough to see this day. I just can't believe it's him." The camera shutters clicked like gunfire. Behind her, a detective cleared his throat and stepped forward. "This case haunted investigators for decades," he said firmly. "Today, thanks to advances in forensic genealogy, we were able to identify and arrest the individual responsible for her death." It was the kind of moment you see in headlines, the kind you think will bring closure. But for this family, the reality was more complicated. 53 years ago, on a quiet night in rural Pennsylvania, Anne Hanson, a 19-year-old with dreams of becoming a nurse, vanished without a trace. Her disappearance shattered her small community. Families locked their doors. Rumors spread like wildfire. Police chased every lead. Friends were questioned. Lovers accused. Theories multiplied. But the trail went cold. For half a century, her case was a ghost story whispered around campfires, a scar beneath the surface of a town trying to move on. Until now. Rain tapped softly against the glass of a diner window on the outskirts of town. Inside, warm yellow light spilled across vinyl booths and the smell of coffee hung heavy in the air. Anne Hanson sat in the corner, laughing with a friend over half-empty milkshakes. The jukebox played softly in the background. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. Hours later, she would vanish into the cold February night. By morning, her parents would report her missing. And within days, police would discover her body miles away, deep in the woods. The elderly suspect sat in the back of the police cruiser, expression unreadable, hands trembling slightly in his lap. Outside, reporters shouted questions. "Did you know her? Why now? Why after all these years? What kept you hiding for half a century?" He said nothing. Inside the station, detectives stared at the old case files laid out across a conference table, faded photographs, yellowed witness statements, and one small envelope containing the clue that had finally cracked the case, a decades-old DNA sample preserved from the scene. "It was sitting there this whole time," one detective said softly. "We just didn't have the tools back then." For 53 years, the family carried the weight of unanswered questions. Who could do this to a 19-year-old girl with her whole life ahead of her? How could someone walk among them, undetected, for decades? And why did it take half a century to bring him to justice? As the cruiser pulled away, the victim's sister stared after it, clutching the photograph tighter. "People say time heals," she whispered, voice breaking. "But time doesn't heal this. Time just hides it, until it comes back." Before the headlines, before the endless theories, before her name became a ghost story whispered for decades, she was just a 19-year-old girl. A daughter. A sister. A friend. And she had no idea her life was about to be stolen. Pennsylvania, spring 1971, 1 year before the murder. The small town of Mill Creek, Pennsylvania was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody. Rows of brick storefronts lined Main Street. A single movie theater showed one film at a time. On Friday nights, teenagers gathered at the diner, sharing jukebox songs and milkshakes while waitresses wove between the booths. And somewhere in the middle of it all was Anne Hanson. She wasn't the loudest in the room, but she had a way of drawing people in. Brown curls framed her heart-shaped face, and her green eyes carried a quiet brightness, like someone who still believed in big dreams. She worked part-time at Dale's Pharmacy downtown, stacking aspirin bottles and ringing up cough drops, saving every penny to pay her way through nursing school. Her friends said she always talked about wanting to help people, even though she'd barely stepped outside Mill Creek her whole life. Interview, childhood friend, dramatized. She had this little notebook she carried everywhere, recalls Karen Miller, one of her closest friends. She'd write down everything she learned, medicines, symptoms, anything she thought might help her be a better nurse one day. I remember telling her once, "Anne Hanson, you can't save everybody." And she just smiled and said, "Doesn't mean I shouldn't try." A glimpse of family life. Her parents, Margaret and Thomas, were proud of her, though they worried about her late-night walks home from work. The family lived in a small, pale yellow house on Willow Creek Road, its paint chipped in places, the front porch sagging a little with age. Inside, the house was filled with little pieces of her personality. A stack of nursing textbooks beside her bed. A faded Polaroid of her and her younger sister, Ellen, laughing by the creek. A record player, needle-worn from playing Carole King and the Beatles on repeat. Ellen, who was just 14 at the time, remembers sneaking into her sister's room to borrow clothes. "She'd get so mad at me," Ellen says with a laugh. "But she'd always end up helping me pick out something anyway. She was like that, tough when she had to be, but soft underneath." The summer before. The summer of 1971 was her last before everything changed. Her days were simple but full. Mornings spent working at the pharmacy. Afternoons sunbathing at Willow Creek Lake with friends. Evenings walking home under street lamps, notebook tucked under her arm, humming softly to herself. That was also the summer she started seeing someone, a quiet, older man who lived a few streets over. Friends remember him as polite but distant, someone who seemed hard to read. At the time, no one thought much of it. Foreshadowing, a warning ignored. One night, over milkshakes at the diner, Karen noticed bruises on her friend's wrist. I asked her about it, Karen remembers. She brushed it off, said she fell on the steps. But something in her eyes told me not to push. I wish I had. The man she'd been seeing would later become one of the first suspects in her case. But in 1971, he was just another face in a town where everyone seemed to know each other. Her dreams. Friends describe her as a planner. Her notebook wasn't just filled with medical notes, it held lists of goals. Finish nursing school. Move to Philadelphia. Travel, at least once. It wasn't much by today's standards, but for a 19-year-old in a small Pennsylvania town in 1972, it was ambitious. She once told her mother, "I want a life that's bigger than this place, Mom. I feel like I'm meant for more." Margaret smiled and tucked a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. "You are," she whispered. Neither of them knew how little time was left. The night before everything changed. On the night of February 5, 1972, she came home late from work, the cold biting at her cheeks. Ellen remembers hearing her sister softly singing along to Carole King's "It's Too Late" as she changed into pajamas. Before bed, she scribbled a note in her notebook. "Double shift tomorrow. Don't forget to call Karen about Saturday." It would be the last entry she ever wrote. Interview, mother, dramatized. I still remember the sound of her laughter that night, Margaret recalls, tears glistening in her eyes. She came into the kitchen, stole a cookie off the counter, and kissed me on the cheek before heading upstairs. That's the last time I saw her alive. A small town holds its breath. In the days after her death, Mill Creek would fracture under the weight of grief and suspicion. Families would lock their doors. Rumors would twist neighbor against neighbor. And for decades, her name would become a wound the town carried quietly, the way small towns often do. But in this moment, before the disappearance, before the crime scene photos and cold case files, she was just a teenager who loved jukebox songs, nursing textbooks, and making plans for a future she'd never see. This isn't just a story about a murder. It's about what was stolen. A daughter who used to twirl around the living room when her favorite record played. A sister who helped Ellen pick out dresses for school dances. A friend who filled Karen's summers with laughter and late-night secrets. And it's about a community that never stopped carrying the weight of her absence, even when the rest of the world forgot her name. Years later, one of her old neighbors would say, "I still see her sometimes." Not really her, but the way she used to walk down Willow Creek Road, hair catching the light, notebook under her arm. That street hasn't felt the same since. Maybe it never will. The last 48 hours of Anne Hanson, as life read like fragments from an unfinished story, a series of ordinary moments, quiet conversations, and fleeting choices that no one thought would matter. But when pieced together decades later, they revealed a pattern no one saw coming. Friday, February 4, 1972, 2 days before. The snow had stopped falling by late afternoon, leaving Mill Creek glazed in ice and pale winter light. At Dale's pharmacy, Anne Hanson was restocking shelves when Karen Miller leaned across the counter. "Double shift again tomorrow?" Karen teased, sipping a Coke. "Nursing school isn't gonna pay for itself," she grinned, brushing a curl out of her face. "Besides, Dale promised me Sundays off." Karen rolled her eyes. "You need a night off. Come out with us tonight." But she shook her head. "Can't. I told Ellen I'd help her with her history project." Foreshadowing beat, it was a small promise. But later, that simple plan, time Ellen expected her sister to be home, would play a key role in shaping the investigation's early timeline. That night, she came home to the little yellow house on Willow Creek Road just after 8:30 p.m. Ellen remembers hearing the front door creak open. "She came into my room, smelling like cold air and coffee. We spent maybe an hour going over my project. Then she hugged me, said she was gonna shower, and that's the last normal night I remember." Saturday, February 5, 1972, the last full day. Morning, 7:15 a.m. Margaret, their mother, woke to the sound of the kettle whistling and found her daughter at the kitchen table, hair still damp, scribbling in her notebook. She was writing about blood pressure, Margaret recalls. "I teased her, told her she needed to write about boys instead. She laughed and said, maybe someday." She packed a sandwich, kissed her mother on the cheek, and hurried to work. It was the last time Margaret saw her alive. Late morning, 11:40 a.m. Dale's pharmacy was bustling that Saturday, as it always did before the church rush. A security camera, grainy, black and white, one of the first installed downtown, caught her ringing up a customer, chatting casually. That footage would become one of the last confirmed sightings of her. Afternoon, 2:15 p.m. After work, she stopped at Harper's Diner. Multiple witnesses remembered seeing her slide into a booth with a tall man in his mid-30s. The man was later identified as Richard Hale, a recently divorced mechanic who lived a few streets away. Waitress testimony says they seemed to argue quietly. Richard claimed they were just catching up. He insisted she left alone. Police noted this in their early reports, marking Richard as a person of interest, but without evidence, he was eventually cleared. Evening, 6:05 p.m. She returned home briefly. Ellen remembers hearing her sister humming softly in the kitchen as she pulled on a brown suede coat and grabbed her notebook. She said she was meeting Karen at the diner later, Ellen recalls. "But when I called Karen that night, she said she hadn't seen her. That's when I started worrying." Night, 7:20 p.m. Neighbors saw her walking alone down Willow Creek Road, notebook tucked under her arm. One witness, Mrs. Hawkins, recalled seeing a dark sedan idling by the corner. "I thought it was odd," she said decades later. "I saw her walk past it, and then, the car pulled out real slow, like it was following her." Investigators searched tirelessly for that car in the months that followed, but never found it. The disappearing hours, 8 p.m. to 1 a.m. This is where the timeline begins to blur. At 8:05 p.m., a customer at Harper's Diner swore they saw her sitting alone at the counter, eating pie. Another witness, a truck driver making a delivery, claimed he saw her talking to a man outside the diner around 8:30 p.m. At 9 p.m., someone matching her description was reportedly seen entering a corner gas station 2 blocks over. None of these sightings could ever be fully verified. By 11 p.m., a light snow began to fall. The streets emptied. No one saw her alive again. Sunday, February 6, 1972, day of the disappearance. Morning, 9:15 a.m. Ellen knocked softly on her sister's bedroom door. No answer. Assuming she was sleeping in after a late night, she padded downstairs and waited for the familiar creak of the stairs that never came. By noon, when Margaret called Dale's pharmacy and learned she hadn't shown up for her shift, panic set in. "I knew right then something was wrong," Margaret said years later. She was never late. Not once. Afternoon, 2:45 p.m. The family reported her missing. Within hours, Mill Creek PD canvassed the town. Posters went up within days. Officers interviewed friends, co-workers, and anyone who might have seen her. Dogs searched the wooded areas near Willow Creek Lake. But there were no signs of her. No one knew in 1972 was that one overlooked clue, a single DNA sample, preserved almost by accident, would eventually bring everything to light. Foreshadowing closing beat. Years later, Karen still struggles with the what ifs. "I keep thinking, if I'd made her come out with us that Friday night, if I'd called her back on Saturday, maybe she wouldn't have been alone. Maybe she'd still be here." She pauses, wiping away tears. But that's the thing about small choices, isn't it? You never know which ones will change everything. March 12, 1980. Millfield, Spring. The day began like any other, until a local farmer made a discovery that would change everything. Henry Calloway, archival interview, 1995. I came down that road every morning before sunrise. But that day, something felt wrong. At first, I thought it was trash, maybe a deer carcass. But when I got closer. Henry, interview, trembling voice. It wasn't no animal. Lying face down in a shallow ditch, partially covered by leaves, was 23-year-old Julie Hanson. Missing for 4 days. Silenced forever. First responders arrive. Visual, sirens flash faintly through the fog as a sheriff's cruiser pulls up. Deputy Carl Benson, now retired, speaks in an interview setting. Deputy Benson, present-day interview. I still remember the smell of wet earth mixed with death. We didn't have fancy crime scene units back then, just us, some Polaroids, and gut instinct. Benson, continuing. We roped off the area and waited for the coroner. But right away, we could see, this wasn't an accident. There were drag marks. Bruising on her wrists. Whoever did this wanted her gone. Marianne, present-day interview. Mama was making coffee when the phone rang. I still hear her scream sometimes. It was this deep, raw sound I didn't even know a person could make. For the Hanson family, hope died that morning. But for investigators, their work had only just begun. Investigators collected everything they could find. Torn fabric fibers, cigarette butts, a muddy boot print. And a single silver bracelet, still clasped tightly around Julie's wrist. Forensic analyst, archival interview, 1998. Back then, DNA testing didn't exist. We worked with what we had, fingerprints, blood typing, shoe impressions. Every detail mattered, but progress was slow. It would take more than 4 decades. But that bracelet would one day unlock the truth. Local resident, archival audio. Everybody knew Julie. Sweet girl. Always laughing. The thought that somebody around here could have done this? Folks started sleeping with their doors locked for the first time. Millfield wasn't used to violent crime. Julie's death shattered the illusion of safety, and suspicion turned inward. We're looking at several persons of interest. We're asking anyone with information to come forward. Somebody out there knows what happened to Julie Hanson. We had our suspicions back then, but without evidence, it was like chasing shadows. Every lead went cold. Young woman found dead in Millfield. Killer still at large. Leads DIY up Anne Hanson murder. No arrests. No suspects charged. And over time, Julie's case faded from headlines. But never from the minds of those who loved her. For 43 years, her file sat gathering dust. Until a team of cold case investigators decided to take another look. And what they found would finally bring Julie home. Julie Hanson had dreams, a future, a family that loved her. But someone stole all of that in the spring of 1980. And for decades, justice seemed out of reach. Until now. June 15, 1980, Pennsylvania, spring. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the Carolina sky in muted shades of orange and gray. Outside the modest clapboard house on Ashbury Lane, a stillness clung to the air, the kind that settles after chaos. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered lazily in the morning breeze, cordoning off the small yard where neighbors huddled in stunned silence. A once quiet cul-de-sac now looked like something out of a nightmare. Flashing blue lights reflected off the windows, uniformed officers paced the driveway, and a coroner's van idled by the curb. Inside the house, the mood was heavier. Detective Raymond Ray Hargrove's arrival. Detective Ray Hargrove, 38, a seasoned investigator with the Wake County Sheriff's Office, stepped carefully into the living room. The carpet was littered with evidence markers, each one a tiny reminder of what they'd lost, and what they didn't yet understand. Ray, V.O. The first thing you learn in homicide is that the dead can't talk. The second? The living will lie to you, every time. He adjusted his tie, a nervous habit, and crouched beside the overturned coffee table. A broken mug lay shattered, its handle separated from the rest. Whoever did this, Ray muttered, wasn't here by accident. Inside the house, cataloging chaos. The victim, Julie Hanson, 23, had been found in the small hallway between the kitchen and the bedroom. There were no signs of forced entry. No smashed locks. No broken windows. Just silence. Crime scene techs moved methodically through the cramped space, dusting for prints and photographing every square inch. A pale hand extended from beneath a rumpled throw blanket, the one an officer had draped over her, but even without seeing her face, the gravity of it hung thick in the air. The lead forensic specialist, Karen Patel, snapped on a fresh pair of gloves. Karen, no struggle marks on the door. No kicked frames. Nothing forced. Ray, so she knew them. Karen, or, they wanted us to think that. Neighbors, rumors, and whispers. Outside, the street buzzed with speculation. Neighbors traded theories in hushed voices. I heard she'd been seeing someone. No, it was drugs, I swear. Didn't she have a fight with her ex last week? The more they whispered, the more the lines blurred between truth and gossip. Detective Hargrove knew better than to ignore any of it. Every rumor was a breadcrumb, but chasing the wrong one could waste precious hours. First break in the investigation, the letter. While processing Julie's bedroom, Karen pulled a sealed envelope from beneath the mattress. Inside was a handwritten note, folded twice, smudged with fingerprints. Julie, you don't know what you've done. Stay out of this, or there'll be consequences. No signature. No return address. Just a warning. Hargrove stared at the paper, his jaw tightening. Ray, looks like she was into something bigger than anyone thought. Interviewing the boyfriend, first suspect. By mid-morning, detectives brought in Evan Brooks, Julie's 25-year-old boyfriend, for questioning. He sat slouched in a plastic chair, arms crossed, avoiding eye contact. Hargrove, when's the last time you saw her? Evan, last night. I dropped her off after dinner. She was fine. Hargrove, anyone else there? Evan, no. We argued a little. About money. But I didn't do this. His alibi, that he'd spent the night at his brother's place, would need verification. Forensics speak louder than words. By noon, the lab confirmed partial fingerprints from the envelope matched neither Julie nor Evan. A second set, unidentified, had been found on the kitchen counter near where her body lay. Blood samples collected from the carpet revealed something else, a small, almost imperceptible smear that didn't belong to Julie. That meant the killer might have cut themselves, and that DNA could be their way in. The pressure mounts. By sunset, reporters swarmed the quiet street. The headline practically wrote itself. Young woman found dead in Ashbury Lane home, police investigating possible foul play. Hargrove hated this part, the circus, the sensationalism. But he also knew pressure could work in his favor. Someone out there knew what happened. Someone out there was scared enough to make a mistake. A new lead, the gas station tape. Late that night, just as Hargrove prepared to leave, a uniformed officer approached with something promising. Officer, detective, you'll want to see this. Gas station 3 blocks over pulled security footage. At 1:37 a.m., roughly an hour before Julie's estimated time of death, a dark blue Ford pickup was caught idling near her street. The license plate? Half obscured by mud. But it was a start. Unanswered questions. Back in his car, Hargrove scribbled notes under the glow of the dashboard lights. He stared at the crime scene photos pinned on his board and whispered under his breath. Ray, V.O. Whoever killed Julie thought they were careful. But nobody's careful enough. Not forever. Outside, the night deepened, swallowing Ashbury Lane in shadows. This was only the beginning. Summer, 1981. The town of Pennsylvania, spring had grown quiet again. 4 months, it had been a hive of activity, squad cars, flashing lights, and swarms of reporters crowding the courthouse steps. But now, the frenzy had died down. For investigators, this wasn't relief. It was dread. We were back to square one. Detective Harold Connors, Millfield PD. The body of Anne Hanson had been discovered 6 months earlier, and yet, despite dozens of leads, nothing stuck. No one had been charged. No suspects officially named. And in a town where everybody thought they knew everybody, that silence was deafening. The investigation stalls. Detective Connors sat in his cramped office, a half-drunk cup of cold coffee on the desk, staring at the stack of files. Witness statements, photographs, lab reports, all of it meticulously organized, and yet, useless. We kept circling the same suspects, asking the same questions, Connors would later admit. Every time we thought we had a lead, it evaporated. It was like chasing smoke. The killer had left no fingerprints, no murder weapon, and the DNA technology we rely on today didn't exist yet. Back in 1981, forensic science could only do so much. Fibers were collected, but without databases, they meant nothing. Tire tracks were photographed, but dozens of similar tires were sold in the area. Witnesses reported seeing a dark sedan, but half the town owned one. Every lead bled into another dead end. The Hanson family's living nightmare. For Julie's parents, Robert and Helen Hanson, time didn't move forward. It just circled endlessly around the night their daughter vanished. Helen stopped cooking dinner. Stopped answering the phone. The front porch light, the one Julie used to come home to, stayed on for months. I used to dream she'd walk through the door, Helen told a local reporter years later, her voice cracking. I'd sit up all night waiting, thinking maybe they got it wrong. Maybe she wasn't really gone. Robert, a quiet, proud man, took to repairing old radios in the garage, anything to keep his hands busy. But no matter how many knobs he turned or wires he soldered, he couldn't fix the one thing that mattered. The family splintered under the weight of unanswered questions. Why Julie? Who did this? Why can't anyone find them? The community fractures. In small towns like Millfield, fear spreads fast. Parents warned their daughters not to walk home alone. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts and window locks. Strangers eyed each other differently. For years, nobody trusted anybody, remembers Carol Whitman, Julie's high school friend. We used to leave our doors unlocked. After Julie, that stopped. Local rumors filled the silence left by the investigation. Some whispered about Julie's ex-boyfriend, a factory worker with a temper. Others blamed a traveling salesman spotted in the area that summer. A few even suspected one of their own neighbors. With no arrest, paranoia thrived. Detectives under pressure. By early 1982, the Millfield Police Department was drowning. The media hammered them. Town council meetings turned hostile. Detective Connors and his team drove hundreds of miles chasing tips, knocking on doors, questioning anyone who might have known Julie, but the result was always the same, nothing. Would work a 16-hour day, get home, lie down, and still see her file when we closed our eyes. Connors recalled years later. Some officers started to burn out. Others transferred. A few quietly admitted what nobody wanted to say out loud. We weren't gonna solve this one. A family left behind. Every anniversary was agony. Every milestone was a reminder. Julie's 24th birthday came and went with no celebration. Her younger brother, Matt, graduated high school, she wasn't there. Friends married, had kids, built lives, while Julie remained frozen in time. Helen kept her daughter's room exactly as it was the day she disappeared. Posters on the wall, books on the nightstand, clothes folded neatly in the dresser. I couldn't change anything, Helen said in a later interview. If I moved her things, it would feel like admitting she wasn't coming back. Robert handled his grief differently. He became angry, directing his frustration at the police. He called the station weekly, demanding updates, demanding answers. But deep down, he began to believe what nobody dared say aloud. Julie's case was slipping into cold territory. Years turned to decades. By the late 1990s, the case file sat gathering dust in an evidence room. Detective Connors had retired. Helen and Robert grew older, their faces marked by time and grief. The Millfield community moved on, but the Hanson family never could. Every Christmas, Helen would hang one extra stocking. Every birthday, she'd bake a cake. She never stopped hoping for closure, but hope without answers is a slow kind of torture. A toll measured in silence. By 2005, Helen passed away without ever knowing who took her daughter. Robert followed a few years later. Matt Hanson, Julie's younger brother, carried the weight now. It's like living with a ghost, Matt said in a 2012 interview. Our family froze in 1980. Everyone else kept moving. We didn't. For the Hanson family, time didn't heal, it hardened. The case fades, but doesn't die. By 2010, Millfield had changed. New subdivisions went up where cornfields used to be. A new generation filled the schools. Many didn't even know Julie Hanson's name. But inside the dusty shelves of the Millfield Police Department's archives, her file remained. A single box, filled with yellowing photographs, typed witness statements, sealed evidence bags, untouched for decades. It was a box that whispered a promise. One day, someone will come looking again. And the years turned into decades, and yet the shadow of that night in Millfield refused to fade. By the mid-1980s, Julie Hanson's disappearance wasn't just a mystery anymore. It had become a story, passed from parent to child, neighbor to neighbor, whispered in the hallways of Millfield High, murmured at church potlucks and late-night diner counters. At first, people stuck to the facts, the ones they thought they knew. Julie had vanished without a trace on a warm June evening in 1979. Her car was found abandoned, her purse inside, her keys still dangling from the ignition. No signs of struggle. No note. No body. But as the years wore on, facts softened into speculation, and speculation hardened into legend. The girl by the bridge. Teenagers swore they'd seen her, a pale figure standing by the old Millfield Bridge on misty nights, frozen in time. If you drive past at midnight, they'd whisper, "You'll see her. But don't stop. If you stop, she gets in the car." Some swore they had friends of friends who'd seen her reflection in the rearview mirror, a fleeting silhouette, hair damp with river mist, her eyes hollow, searching. Local sheriff's deputies, annoyed by the constant reports, would shrug it off. But more than one officer admitted, off the record, that they'd felt uneasy patrolling that stretch of road on quiet nights. The locked room theory. Others believed Julie never left Millfield at all. An urban myth took hold in the mid-1990s, the idea that she was being held captive, hidden somewhere in plain sight. There are tunnels under the old paper mill, people would say. You know they used to smuggle booze there during Prohibition? What if she's down there? Teenagers dared each other to break into the crumbling mill on the edge of town. Inside, they'd find graffiti, crude messages scrawled across damp concrete walls. Julie lives. She sees you. Every discovery added fuel to the paranoia, even when detectives confirmed that the writing was recent, nothing more than kids feeding the myth. The suspects who never slept. With no arrests, the town filled the silence with its own suspects. Some whispered about the boyfriend who'd been the last to see her alive. Others were convinced it was a drifter passing through. And then there were the darker theories, the ones that accused people within the community itself. A retired sheriff, interviewed years later, recalled how brutal the rumors became. We had neighbors turning on neighbors. Folks pointing fingers at their own kin. It was like the whole town was trying to exorcise a ghost by naming a killer. The Hanson family, desperate for answers, lived under a microscope. Every new rumor reopened wounds that never healed. Folklore or warning? Over time, Julie's story stopped feeling like history and started sounding like a warning. Parents used it to keep their kids close. Don't walk home alone after dark. Don't talk to strangers. Don't go down near the bridge. By the early 2000s, an entire generation had grown up with Julie Hanson as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even small towns have shadows. But under the surface, something more unsettling was happening. Some kids, raised on those warnings, began to see Julie not as a victim but as a vengeful spirit. Local ghost tours picked up on the myth, spinning stories about a cursed road and a woman trapped between worlds. One paranormal podcast even claimed to have EVP recordings of her voice, a faint, whispered "help me" beneath the sound of rushing water. It was entertainment for outsiders. But for Millfield, it was personal. When myth replaces memory. By the 2010s, Millfield had moved on, at least on the surface. The old bridge was rebuilt. The paper mill finally demolished. And yet, every few years, a new wave of interest would sweep through, reigniting old wounds. True crime blogs. Amateur sleuth forums. Reddit threads filled with uncovered evidence that detectives had debunked decades ago. In 2018, a viral TikTok claimed Julie's ghost could be summoned if you stood on the rebuilt bridge at exactly 3:07 a.m. and whispered her name 3 times. Teenagers tried it. Videos flooded social media. But for Julie's younger sister, Claire, now in her 50s, there was nothing amusing about it. People forget she was real, Claire said in a 2020 interview. She laughed. She dreamed. She had favorite songs. Now she's a ghost story on TikTok. That's not who she was. A town haunted. 4 decades later, Millfield was still caught between memory and myth. Julie's case was unsolved. Her name lived on, but in fragments, distorted by time. Some clung to the hope she'd run away, started a new life somewhere, maybe even had a family. Others believed, deep down, that the river had claimed her that night and simply refused to give her back. But for the Hanson family, hope was never optional. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, they'd gather by the riverbank with candles and prayers, their faces illuminated by soft, flickering light. The whispers would always return afterward. The theories. The sightings. The ghost stories. Julie Hanson had become 2 people. The real young woman who vanished on a warm summer night. And the legend the town built to explain why. For Millfield, both versions haunted them. And neither had answers. A case frozen in time. For over 4 decades, the case file sat buried in a dust-choked evidence room. The manila folders were yellowed with age, their edges curling, filled with grainy black and white photographs of a girl whose life had been stolen. Each year, the labels faded a little more. Each year, the chances of justice grew thinner. Detective Laura McKinney, now in her 60s, still kept a copy of the case file on her bookshelf at home. She had worked the investigation in its earliest days, fresh out of the academy, filled with idealism and fire. "I used to think," she would later recall, "that if you just worked hard enough, if you cared enough, the truth would always come out. But time has a way of burying things." The case had become a ghost, a story whispered at family gatherings, a wound that never healed, and in the town's folklore, almost a cautionary tale. And then, in the spring of 2021, something extraordinary happened. Beat 2, a box that shouldn't exist. It started with a routine cleanup. In the basement of the Millfield County Courthouse, archivist Janice Porter was tasked with clearing out storage rooms ahead of renovations. Rows upon rows of rusted filing cabinets lined the space. Some hadn't been opened since the early 80s. She pulled at a dented drawer, coughing as a plume of dust hit her face. Inside, she found an unmarked cardboard box wedged between files on unrelated cases. It was taped shut, brittle from age. Curious, Janice carried it upstairs, thinking it was misplaced evidence from a civil matter. When she lifted the lid, she froze. Inside were sealed plastic bags containing clothing, jewelry, and, most chillingly, a small lock of dark hair. There was also a faded tag, handwritten in smudged ink. Hanson, Julie, Millfield PD, 1979. Janice immediately called the sheriff's office. Beat 4, the match that changed everything. The DNA was uploaded into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, a sprawling database of profiles from convicted offenders, unsolved cases, and arrestees across the country. Investigators waited. Hours passed. Then a notification pinged on the lab screen. A match. The name sent shockwaves through the department. It wasn't some drifter. It wasn't a stranger passing through town. It was someone they all knew. Richard "Rick" Holloway, a former Millfield resident, now living quietly 2 states away. Back in 1979, he'd been a local mechanic, a guy who drank beer at the same bars as the investigating officers, even coached Little League one summer. He'd been interviewed at the time, sure, but there was never enough to tie him to the crime. Now, the science was clear. The odds of the DNA belonging to anyone else? Less than 1 in a trillion. Beat 5, emotional fallout. The news hit the Hanson family like a tidal wave. 4 decades, Helen Hanson, Julie's younger sister, had lived with unanswered questions. Every anniversary, she lit a candle and whispered the same words, "We just want the truth." When detectives knocked on her door, Helen braced for disappointment, another empty lead, another almost. Instead, she heard the name Rick Holloway and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "I knew him," she whispered. "We all knew him." Helen broke down, sobbing into her hands. Relief and anger collided, decades of bottled-up grief rushing to the surface. "I thought I'd prepared myself," she later told a local reporter. "But nothing prepares you to learn that someone you trusted, someone who waved to us from across the street, took her from us." Beat 6, reopening Pandora's box. With the DNA match confirmed, the sheriff's office reopened the case in full. Detectives unearthed old witness statements, crime scene sketches, and forgotten reports. Names that had faded from memory were suddenly on everyone's lips again. But reopening the case stirred up more than just evidence. Some longtime residents resisted digging up the past. Others wanted answers, now. Town forums turned heated. Social media threads spiraled with accusations. And, perhaps most unsettling of all, former friends and neighbors of Rick Holloway came forward with stories they'd kept buried. A bartender remembered a strange comment he'd made the week Julie disappeared. A co-worker recalled him showing up to work with scratches on his arm. A friend confessed that Holloway once insisted on driving the long way home that night, something that never sat right. For the first time in 42 years, it felt like the walls were closing in on the killer. Beat 7, a clock restarts. In September 2021, detectives secured an arrest warrant. At 6:43 a.m., a convoy of unmarked SUVs rolled quietly through the suburban cul-de-sac where Holloway now lived. He opened the door in a faded t-shirt, holding a coffee mug, utterly unsuspecting. When the handcuffs clicked shut, a neighbor gasped from across the street. "Rick? What's going on?" He didn't answer. He just stared at the ground. 42 years after Julie and Hanson vanished, the man accused of taking her life was finally in custody. And with that arrest, everything changed. Hope, tainted by time. For the Hanson family, this was the breakthrough they had prayed for, but it came with a haunting truth. Nothing could bring Julie back. Nothing could restore the years stolen from her, or erase the pain etched into her loved ones' lives. Yet, for the first time, there was a path forward. Justice moves slow, Detective McKinney reflected, but it moves. And with a single box, a single strand of DNA, a case once buried beneath decades of silence was about to go to trial, and every dark secret Millfield had buried with it was about to surface. A file pulled from the shadows. 43 years. That's how long the box sat there. Inside the cold case storage room at the Pennsylvania Police Department, the air smells of dust, cardboard, and forgotten stories. Rows of steel shelves stretch endlessly, holding thousands of manila folders, each one a life interrupted, a story without an ending. Detective Marissa Cole, now in her late 40s, walks down the narrow aisle, her gloved fingers brushing along faded case numbers. The hum of fluorescent lights above is the only sound, until she stops. A single white label catches her eye. Hanson, Julie, 1979. Status, unsolved. She exhales sharply, pulling the heavy box down from the shelf. Narrator, V.O. 4 decades, the case of Julie Hanson sat in the shadows, gathering dust. Investigators retired. Witnesses disappeared. And her family, they stopped hoping. Technological breakthrough. By 2023, the landscape of forensic science had completely transformed. Back in 1979, investigators collected evidence, fibers, blood samples, cigarette butts, but without modern technology, much of it was useless. Now, DNA testing had evolved into something almost surgical. Even the tiniest biological trace, a single skin cell, a microscopic fragment of saliva, could solve a murder. Detective Cole sets the box on the metal table in the evidence lab. Inside are photographs, handwritten notes, and, most importantly, a sealed envelope containing biological samples. Cole, whispering, "Let's see what you've been hiding all these years." The lab, science meets memory. Inside the Pennsylvania Forensics Lab, the hum of machines fills the air. Technicians in white coats handle evidence like ancient relics, knowing that one mistake could destroy decades of hope. Dr. Elena Vargas, the lead forensic analyst, leans over the workstation. "Vargas. This sample's degraded, but with next-gen sequencing, we can rebuild the profile." The old blood sample, once thought unusable, is loaded into a machine smaller than a microwave, but powerful enough to unlock a 43-year-old secret. Days turn into weeks of analysis, cross-referencing, and running the profile through CODIS, the national DNA database. Every beep of the machines, every line of data scrolling across the monitors, brings investigators closer to the truth. Family reactivated. While the science churns, the Hanson family gets a call they'd stopped expecting. Inside a small kitchen in Millfield, Margaret Hanson, now in her 70s, clutches the phone. Cole, voice through the line. "Mrs. Hanson, we've reopened Julie's case. We've submitted evidence for DNA testing." Silence. Then, a faint, shaky breath. "Margaret. You think you can find him? After all this time?" Cole. "We can't promise answers, but we finally have tools we didn't back then. And we won't stop." Margaret lowers the phone, staring at a faded photo of Julie on the refrigerator. Her lips tremble as she whispers, "Baby girl, maybe now." First breakthrough, a partial match. Weeks later, Dr. Vargas bursts into Cole's office, holding a thin folder. "Vargas. We have something. It's not a full hit, but it's enough, a familial DNA match. The profile from the crime scene partially aligns with a distant relative in CODIS, a man arrested in Georgia in 2019 for an unrelated charge. It's not the killer, but it's a thread. And for the first time in decades, they can follow it, rebuilding the past." Detectives begin constructing a family tree, tracing branches backward through generations until names start to align. The deeper they dig, the clearer the picture becomes. One name keeps surfacing, a man who lived in Millfield in 1979, a man who abruptly moved away right after Julie's disappearance. The name, Ronnie Tate. Interviewing the ghosts of 1979. Detective Cole drives through Millfield's winding backroads, knocking on doors, reopening wounds. Former friends. Old boyfriends. Former co-workers. Each one paints a piece of the picture. Ronnie Tate was known for his temper. He worked at a gas station less than 2 miles from where Julie disappeared. And on the night she vanished, someone saw his green Chevy Nova parked near the riverbank. But Tate? He's gone. No forwarding address. No recent records. Like a ghost evaporated into thin air. Confronting the wall. Weeks stretch into months. Leads dry up. Again. Cole sits in her car one night outside Julie's childhood home, frustrated, exhausted, and haunted. Cole, to herself. I promised her mother. I promised. Then her phone buzzes. An email. Subject line, new database hit. Her hands tremble as she opens it. The moment the past collides with the present. The partial match had finally led them to an exact DNA hit. Ronald Tate died in 2002, but his son, Michael Tate, is alive. Investigators obtain a warrant for Michael's DNA. The test comes back conclusive. The sample from 1979 matches Ronald Tate. After 43 years, they finally know who killed Julie Hanson. The press conference. Flanked by local officials, Detective Cole steps up to the podium. Microphones crowd forward. Camera shutters click. Cole. Today, after more than 4 decades, we can confirm that Ronald Tate was responsible for the 1979 murder of Julie Hanson. While Tate passed away in 2002, we hope this brings some measure of peace to the Hanson family. Reporters shout questions, but Cole's gaze finds Margaret Hanson in the front row. The elderly woman clutches Julie's photo in her hands, tears streaming silently. That night, Margaret places a single white lily on Julie's gravestone. Margaret, softly. We got him, baby. We finally got him. The camera pulls back, the cemetery bathed in golden sunset light. 43 years of silence, finally broken. March 2022. Pennsylvania, spring. Detective Hannah Mercer leaned against the hood of her unmarked sedan, watching a modest, weather-beaten house at the end of a cul-de-sac. Her coffee had long gone cold, but her pulse thrummed with quiet adrenaline. Inside, the man they believed had evaded justice for over 4 decades sat on his recliner, flipping channels like it was any other Tuesday morning. Mercer, V.O. 43 years of dead ends. 43 years of whispers and rumors. But science doesn't forget. The DNA breakthrough. 6 months earlier, the Spring State Crime Lab had uploaded the new DNA profile, painstakingly reconstructed from evidence recovered back in 1980, into the FBI's CODIS database. And then it happened. A partial familial match lit up the screen. The name attached, Daniel Whitaker, 63 years old, living less than an hour from where Julie Hanson's body was discovered in 1980. It wasn't a direct hit, not yet, but it was the first real lead investigators had gotten in decades. The stakeout. Detectives Mercer and Tom Alvarez spent the next 4 weeks shadowing Whitaker's every move. They trailed him to the local hardware store. Parked across from his church on Sundays. Followed him when he visited his sister in Cary. Whitaker was cautious, but not paranoid. He lived alone, drove a rusted-out Ford Ranger, and kept to himself. But every detail fed into the growing picture. He worked as a mechanic in the late 70s, placing him miles from the crime scene the night Julie vanished. Alvarez, to Mercer. 40 years, Hannah. Guy probably thinks he got away with it. Mercer, watching Whitaker exit a grocery store. That's what they all think, until the knock comes. Interviewing the ghosts of the past. Before making a move, detectives re-interviewed old witnesses, the ones still alive. Julie's younger brother, now in his 60s, broke down recalling the night she disappeared. A former co-worker remembered Whitaker as quiet, but weird around women. And an ex-girlfriend, tracked down in Florida, recalled a chilling memory. One night, he came home with blood on his hands. Told me it was from fixing a car. I didn't ask questions. The pattern sharpened. The net tightened. Collecting the DNA. Detectives couldn't risk tipping Whitaker off with an interview. They needed confirmation first. One cold morning, Whitaker stopped at a gas station. He bought a coffee, sipped half, and tossed the cup into the trash. Within minutes, Alvarez retrieved it wearing gloves, carefully sealing it into an evidence bag. 2 weeks later, the results came back. It was a match. The DNA pulled from Julie's clothing in 1980 belonged to Daniel Whitaker. Interrogation prep, playing the long game. They didn't storm his house. Not yet. The DA wanted the case airtight, no room for technicalities. Mercer and Alvarez spent days building their timeline. Whitaker's work logs from 1979 to 1980. Vehicle records matching a truck seen near the crime scene. Witness statements from old friends who remembered his wild temper. The prosecution team called it a puzzle 43 years in the making. The arrest. April 14, 2023. At 6:15 a.m., three unmarked vehicles rolled quietly into Whitaker Street. Detective Mercer approached the door, Alvarez close behind. Knock. Knock. Daniel Whitaker? Pennsylvania PD. We need to talk. Whitaker opened the door in a faded flannel shirt, eyes bleary but guarded. For a moment, there was silence. Then Mercer spoke. Daniel, we have your DNA. His face drained of color. He didn't resist when they cuffed him. Inside the interrogation room. The footage from the interrogation would later air on Dateline, captivating millions. For 6 hours, Whitaker sat stone-faced, arms crossed, denying everything. Then Mercer slid a folder across the table. Inside, a photo of Julie from 1979, alongside the DNA match report. Mercer. 43 years, Daniel. She was 23. You left her in that ditch, and you thought nobody would care. We cared. A long silence. Then Whitaker whispered, almost to himself. I knew this day would come. Impact on the families. When Julie's brother got the call, he broke down. I thought I'd die without knowing who took her from us. Finally, we can breathe. But closure came mixed with rage. 43 years meant parents died without answers, siblings raised children without their sister, and an entire town carried a shadow. The press descended on Pennsylvania, calling it one of spring's oldest cold cases solved by DNA. Justice, at last. Whitaker was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. He pleaded not guilty. But for the first time since 1980, investigators felt certainty. Mercer, V.O. We don't get to choose how long the truth takes to surface. But it always does. The knock at the door. It was just after 6:15 a.m. on a cold February morning in 2023 when the quiet suburban calm of Greensboro, spring shattered. Neighbors later recalled the sound, 3 sharp knocks, echoing down the cul-de-sac. Inside a modest 2-story house, Charles Chuck Harmon, now 62 years old, shuffled down the hallway in slippers. His thinning hair was damp from a half-finished shower, and he muttered something under his breath about who the hell knocks this early. He didn't know it yet, but in less than an hour, every secret he had buried was about to surface. Through the peephole, he saw them, 2 plainclothes detectives flanking FBI agent Emily Carter, their badges glinting faintly under the porch light. Detective Alejandro Ramirez, Mr. Harmon? We need to speak with you. Charles opened the door halfway, his expression an uneasy mix of curiosity and suspicion. Charles Harmon, this about my neighbor's car again? Agent Carter, calm, firm no, sir. This is about Julie Anne Hanson. The name froze him. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He gripped the door frame instinctively, knuckles whitening. Ramirez, we have a warrant, Mr. Harmon. The takedown, 43 years in the making. In less than 60 seconds, Harmon's quiet world collapsed. 2 marked cruisers rolled silently to the curb. A tactical unit flanked the side yard. Neighbors stepped onto their porches, bathrobes wrapped tight, phones in hand, whispering the same thing over and over. What's going on? Who is that? Why are the FBI here? Harmon tried to protest, muttering phrases like this is ridiculous and you've got the wrong guy, but his voice cracked under the strain. When the cuffs clicked around his wrists, he stopped speaking altogether. His head bowed. Shoulders slack. After 43 years, the ghost of Julie Anne Hanson had finally come knocking. Inside the interrogation room. The Greensboro Police Department's interview room smelled faintly of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Harmon sat at the metal table, wrists chained loosely in front of him, eyes fixed on the scuffed floor tiles. Across from him, Detective Ramirez leaned forward, arms folded, while Agent Carter stood in the corner, silent but watchful. On the table between them sat a sealed manila folder, the culmination of decades of dead ends, breakthroughs, and one final DNA match. Ramirez slid it forward, opening it slowly, letting Harmon see the evidence pile up. First came the photo of Julie Anne Hanson, smiling at 23, forever frozen in 1979. Then the crime scene photos, grainy black and white images of the ditch, the torn fabric, the silent woods. Finally, the DNA report. Ramirez, quietly. This isn't 1979 anymore, Chuck. We've got your DNA on the ligature. On the jacket fibers. On her. Harmon flinched. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. For the first time, he spoke above a whisper. Harmon, I didn't mean to. Agent Carter leaned in. Carter, then tell us what happened. The breaking point. Hours passed. At first, Harmon denied everything. He claimed he didn't know Julie. Claimed he'd barely seen her around town. But the forensic timeline dismantled every lie. His truck's tire impressions matched the ones found near the ditch in 1979. His old employment records placed him at the textile mill 2 miles from where Julie vanished. A witness, long dismissed in the original investigation, had placed him near the old Millfield Bridge that night. When they showed him the DNA match, 1 in 5.6 trillion odds, something inside Harmon cracked. He let out a sound somewhere between a sigh and a sob, rubbing his face with trembling hands. Then, barely above a whisper, came the words investigators had waited 43 years to hear. Harmon. I just wanted to scare her. I never thought she hit her head. I panicked. God, I panicked. Reconstructing the night. Through tears and fractured sentences, Harmon confessed to the sequence of events. He had seen Julie at a local bar that night in June 1979. They argued outside after he made an unwanted advance. When she resisted, he grabbed her, intending only to teach her a lesson. She fell, hitting her head on a rock. Panicked, he dragged her body to the ditch and left her there, convinced she was unconscious, too terrified to call for help. But Julie never woke up. Harmon, whispering. Every night since, I've seen her face. Thought I'd buried it deep enough. Guess I was wrong. The weight of justice. By mid-afternoon, the story had broken nationwide. 43 years after Julie Hanson vanished, her killer sat in custody. Outside the courthouse, reporters jostled for position, microphones raised, the words "cold case solved" splashed across every chyron. Inside, Julie's surviving sister, Margaret Hanson, clutched a tissue in one hand and a faded photo of Julie in the other. Margaret, through tears. We waited half our lives for this. It doesn't bring her back. But now, we finally know. Full circle. That night, as Harmon sat alone in his cell, the weight of 43 years of silence bore down on him. For investigators like Detective Ramirez and Agent Carter, it wasn't victory they felt, it was relief. A long-dead voice had finally been heard. A forgotten victim finally had justice. And in Pennsylvania, Spring, the small town that had whispered Julie's name for decades, a chapter had finally closed. But beneath that sense of closure lurked something else, something investigators didn't say out loud. If it hadn't been for a single DNA match, Chuck Harmon would have taken this secret to his grave. The weight of justice. March 11, 2024, Wake County Courthouse, Pennsylvania, Spring. The air inside Courtroom 3B felt heavier than oxygen had any right to be. The gallery was packed, reporters, true crime enthusiasts, grieving relatives, and curious locals who'd waited 43 years for this moment. At the defense table sat Richard "Rick" Halpern, now 63 years old. His once dark hair had gone an untamed gray, his cheeks hollow, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched a yellow legal pad. Across from him, at the prosecution's table, sat Assistant District Attorney Monica Reyes, sharp, composed, her expression a mixture of resolve and compassion. For the families of Julie Hanson and Crystal Turner, this trial wasn't just about justice. It was about validation. It was about finally proving they hadn't been imagining things all these years. It was about ending the whispered legends and giving the victims back their dignity. Prosecution's opening, a haunting revisited. Reyes stood, smoothing her blazer before facing the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, for 43 years, this community has lived under a shadow. A young woman disappeared in 1980. A family buried an empty casket. And we were told, repeatedly, that we'd never know what happened to her. But science remembers what men forget. She gestured toward the evidence table, where a sealed DNA report sat under plastic. This isn't about speculation anymore. This isn't about myths, rumors, or ghost stories. This is about facts. And the facts tell us that the defendant, Richard Halpern, abducted and murdered Julie Hanson on the night of October 17, 1980. Every syllable landed like a hammer. In the front row, Martha Hanson, Julie's sister, clenched a tissue so tightly it nearly tore in half. Defense's strategy, sowing doubt. Halpern's attorney, James Whitaker, was old school, suspenders, horn-rimmed glasses, a practiced drawl that leaned into charm when reason failed. He rose slowly, pausing deliberately before he spoke. The prosecution wants you to believe that a test tube is more reliable than a human memory. They want you to convict a man based on a lab result from a scrap of evidence collected over 4 decades ago. But DNA doesn't tell you intent. DNA doesn't tell you circumstance. And it certainly doesn't tell you whether this was murder. Halpern nodded along, lips pursed, as though the attorney's words were gospel. Witness testimonies, ghosts of the past. Over the next 3 weeks, the trial unfolded like a time capsule cracking open. Crime scene investigators from 1980 recounted how limited technology had been, their voices thick with regret. Family members described the sleepless nights, the whispered arguments, the marriages that had collapsed under the weight of uncertainty. The star witness, Dr. Evelyn Chen, a forensic genealogist, walked the jury step by step through the DNA process, explaining how a single degraded hair sample from Julie's sweater had led investigators to Halpern's distant cousin in 2023. Her words were clinical, but their implication was devastating. Statistically speaking, there is a 99.998% probability the DNA belongs to the defendant. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Halpern stared at the table, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The moment of collapse. Midway through the 4th week, something cracked. Under cross-examination, Halpern, who had chosen to testify against his attorney's advice, began to unravel. Prosecutor Reyes: Mr. Halpern, where were you on the night of October 17, 1980? Halpern: I don't know. It's been 40 years, for God's sake. Reyes: and yet, a single strand of your hair was found clenched in Julie Hanson's hand. How do you explain that? Halpern's jaw flexed. His breathing grew shallow. Finally, he whispered. She wasn't supposed to scream. The gallery erupted. Gasps, sobs, a shouted curse from Julie's cousin. The judge slammed his gavel, demanding order, but the damage was done. In a single sentence, Halpern had condemned himself. The verdict: 43 years too late. On April 22, 2024, the jury returned after just 6 hours of deliberation. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder. The words hung in the air like a final bell toll. Martha Hanson collapsed into her daughter's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Julie's father, now 86 and frail, squeezed the worn leather strap of his cane so hard his knuckles turned white, a man who had waited nearly half his life for this sentence. Halpern sat motionless, his expression eerily blank, as if he'd been swallowed whole by the weight of his own secrets. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Aftermath: healing in fragments. Outside the courthouse, the spring air was crisp, but heavy with unspoken things. A cluster of microphones surrounded Martha Hanson. She took a deep breath, wiping her cheeks before speaking. We waited 43 years for this day. 43 years of birthdays missed, Christmases empty, family photos with one face missing. This isn't closure. Nothing brings Julie back. But today, we finally got the truth. Her voice cracked on the last word. Echoes in the community. The verdict rippled beyond the courthouse. For Millfield, a town long defined by rumor and tragedy, it marked the end of an era. For local law enforcement, it was a reminder of how far forensic science had come, and a warning not to underestimate cold cases. For families across the state, it offered something rarer than justice: hope. As one detective put it, every unsolved case is just waiting for the right piece of evidence to wake it up. A grave, no longer forgotten. 2 weeks later, on a quiet Sunday morning, Martha visited Julie's grave. She placed a single yellow daisy, Julie's favorite, on the headstone and whispered, "It's over now, sis. He can't hurt anyone else." The camera would pull back slowly, revealing the cemetery bathed in soft light, the whispers of wind carrying a sense of both mourning and release. For the first time in over 4 decades, the Hanson family could breathe. Quiet after the storm. The courthouse lights had dimmed, the reporters gone, and the cameras packed away. Yet for Detective Hannah Mercer and Agent Emily Carter, the work didn't truly end. They walked down the empty hall, their footsteps echoing against the polished marble floors. The sense of closure was present but tempered by decades of absence. 43 years of unanswered questions, decades of whispers, fear, and grief, all now converged into a single, undeniable truth. Julie Hanson had finally been seen, finally had her story told. Mercer paused at the staircase, looking down at the lobby where hundreds had once crowded for updates. Mercer, VO. Justice isn't always about immediacy. Sometimes it's patience, persistence, and refusing to forget. Impact on the families, generational echoes. Across Millfield, the Hanson family began to reassemble the fragments of their lives. Martha Hanson, now in her late 60s, started volunteering with a local advocacy group for cold case families, determined that no other family should wait decades for answers. Julie's younger brother, long a shadow of grief and frustration, finally found a small sense of peace, even as the loss of formative years remained unhealable. Grandchildren, who had never known their aunt, visited her grave for the first time, learning a story of resilience as much as tragedy. Martha Hanson, interview clip. It doesn't erase the pain, but knowing the truth, that matters. It gives us back a measure of dignity we lost when Julie disappeared. The emotional echoes of her death had spanned generations, and the resolution offered not just closure, but a roadmap for healing through truth. The role of science, a revolution in cold cases. Julie Hanson's case highlighted a profound transformation in forensic science and criminal investigation. DNA sequencing, once rudimentary and often unreliable, had evolved into a forensic superpower, capable of analyzing traces long thought destroyed by time. Genetic genealogy, bridging family trees with criminal databases, allowed investigators to follow threads previously invisible, connecting decades-old evidence to living relatives. In this case, a single hair and a partial DNA match reopened a case frozen in 1980, proving that science can rewrite the past. Dr. Elena Vargas, forensic expert. Back then, evidence might as well have been a ghost. Today, even degraded DNA can shine a light on what we thought was lost. The case became a template for other long unsolved crimes, inspiring departments across the country to revisit cold files with modern technology. Community lessons, trust, fear, and vigilance. Millfield had long been shaped by uncertainty. Rumors, urban legends, and suspicion had seeped into the town's consciousness. Local law enforcement, previously constrained by limited technology and personnel, learned that time is no longer an absolute barrier to justice. Communities, once prone to gossip and fear, began to understand that silence isn't protection, and collective vigilance can eventually tip the scales in favor of truth. A local newspaper editorial reflected. Julie Hanson's case reminds us that truth may sleep for decades, but it rarely dies. Patience, diligence, and science can illuminate even the darkest corners. The broader societal implications. Beyond Millfield, the story sparked national conversations about cold case funding. Small towns, underfunded departments, and rural agencies now received grants to digitize old evidence, knowing that even decades-old crimes could be solved. Rural policing challenges. The case underscored how isolation, limited manpower, and the absence of modern surveillance hindered justice in smaller communities. Victims' rights and advocacy. Families began demanding transparency, insisting that cold cases remain active and that law enforcement leverage modern tools whenever possible. Detective Mercer, VO. The truth doesn't just serve victims, it serves communities. It restores faith that wrongs, no matter how old, will eventually meet accountability. Reflections on justice and human resilience. As the investigation wound down, Mercer and Carter reflected on the human elements that science alone could not capture. The courage of families to never let the case fade from memory. The tenacity of investigators who refused to let age, bureaucracy, or skepticism halt progress. The fragility of life, and the importance of memory and recognition in keeping victims alive in the public consciousness. Mercer visited Julie's grave one final time before leaving Millfield. She knelt, brushing fallen leaves from the headstone, and whispered, "You waited a long time for justice, Julie. But here it is. You're remembered. You're honored. You're not forgotten." The camera pulled back to reveal the cemetery bathed in golden late afternoon light, the town's rolling hills stretching behind it. Even in quiet, there was a sense of restored balance, of a story completed, yet leaving an enduring echo. The cycle of truth. The story of Julie Hanson demonstrates a timeless truth about justice. Crimes may linger in the shadows, and decades can separate action from accountability. But with persistence, science, and human will, even the deepest wounds can find closure. Every solved case reverberates far beyond its immediate circle, inspiring change, vigilance, and hope. Narrator, VO. Julie Hanson's life was stolen, but her story endured. And in the end, the truth proved more powerful than time itself. June 2024, Greensboro, Spring. Detective Hannah Mercer sat in her car, rain streaking the windshield, the dashboard clock blinking 11:47 p.m. The courthouse lights were long gone behind her, and Millfield had finally settled into quiet. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number flashed across the screen. "Detective Mercer? You don't know me. I have information about a case from 1982. It's connected to the Hanson case." Mercer's pulse quickened. She grabbed a pen and a notebook from the passenger seat. "Go on," she whispered. The voice on the other end was shaky, fearful. "I can't talk long. But it's about a woman named Sandra Mayfield, She disappeared in the middle of the night, just outside Millfield. There were rumors, connections, and I think the same man. Mercer's eyes narrowed. Same man? You mean Halpern? Yes, the caller said. He wasn't working alone. The line went dead. The first thread. The next morning, Mercer met with Agent Emily Carter at the Greensboro PD. They spread out old files from 1982, faded, coffee-stained, almost forgotten. Sandra Mayfield had vanished on October 10, 1982, less than 2 years after Julie Hanson. Her car was found abandoned on the edge of the forest. Witnesses had reported a truck leaving the area around 2 a.m., but no arrests were made. What caught Mercer's attention? The vehicle description matched Halpern's Ford Ranger, the same truck tied to Julie's disappearance. Carter, if Halpern's involved, why didn't anyone see the connection back then? Mercer, because the cases were investigated separately. Small towns. Limited resources. Same guy, different shadows. Unearthed evidence. Mercer and Carter went through Halpern's 1982 employment records. A pattern emerged. Travel logs placed him within 10 miles of multiple unsolved disappearances between 1980 and 1983. Payroll slips, handwritten notes, and dated receipts indicated he had frequent late-night absences, previously unexplained. Even more chilling, they found a hand-drawn map in the margin of his 1982 journal, marking a spot along the Millfield Creek, where several locals had claimed they sometimes saw lights moving through the woods at night. Carter, whispering, "This is bigger than we thought. Way bigger." Mercer's stomach turned. A haunting parallel. The team visited the area the map indicated. Muddy footprints, faint tire marks, and old, rusted fencing hinted at something long buried. Mercer, V.O. Julie Hanson's case ended. Halpern is behind bars. But some shadows, some stories, never truly fade. And the past has a way of whispering when you think it's quiet. A crow cawed in the distance. Mercer's flashlight swept across the underbrush. Something glinted in the moonlight, a partially buried metal box, corroded and locked. Carter, this wasn't here before, was it? Mercer didn't answer. Her mind raced, piecing together decades-old disappearances, a single truck, and a man who may never have acted alone. As the rain began again, Mercer pulled out her phone and dialed the cold case unit in Pennsylvania. We need to reopen multiple cases. 1980, 1982, and, possibly others. I think we've only scratched the surface. Behind her, the dark woods seemed to press closer, as if the past itself were watching, waiting. The camera would pull back slowly, showing Mercer standing at the edge of the forest, flashlight in hand, rain dripping from her coat, the glimmering metal box at her feet. Narrator, V.O. Some secrets refuse to stay buried. And for Detective Mercer, the story is far from over.